the Hinterlands of Khuresh, the lands far to the east that the lore of Warhammer Fantasy has never really touched on or divulged much about. It's always been a land shrouded in mystery with scant little mentionings here and there in portions of other races' lores. This land has been brought to life by a beautiful fan-made project with writers 47 KingKongRong and xBloodRaven from our beautiful Warhammer community. And alongside them, concept artists Ruo Yu and Cobol Yu have penned a lot of these amazing ideas in the last couple weeks and months as the four have come together to make this really incredible fan-made jump into the lore of Khuresh. They've fleshed out this lore and they've made a lot of really awesome conceptual artistic pieces that you will be seeing throughout this video. Now, those pieces have not yet been released or completed, so these are just kind of like a, hey, here you go, you can have these as an exclusive access to these art pieces. So I'll wait for them to release them in their entirety on their own Warhammer World Anvil website, which I'm going to be linking in the description so you can actually jump through all this lore on your own and read through it. They only have the origins and lore up so far and one of the unit entries for their army list, but there is plenty more coming. They've been showing me a lot of the concept art in the past weeks, and it's been awesome to just kind of see it all shape up. So I'm excited to share this with you guys, and I'm really excited to see them putting more and more entries into what they've deemed the Brood of the Naga Queens. It's kind of like a DLC pack, as it were, for Warhammer 3. And this is a really exciting thing to talk about too, because with Total War Warhammer 3, we get the advent of Cathay being brought into the grand spectrum of lore for Warhammer Fantasy, right? And even Games Workshop is getting behind that. And the ambition here is to get as much vision on this from CA, from Games Workshop, to say, hey, you know, Khuresh does have a lot of really cool lore that can be fleshed out, and in a really cool, awesome way. So the origin lore of the Naga and Snakemen of Khuresh that they have written out for us is divided into these little chapters. And that's how we're going to go through things today. I'm going to kind of paraphrase things and talk about a little bit of it. And I'll be showing you some of those exclusive art pieces. Again, I do encourage you to please read through it on its own. It deserves all the reverence it can get. But let's have some fun here going through the grand lore of the Hinterlands of Khuresh. And the first chapter is Naissance, and this talks about how the Old Ones come to the Warhammer world and essentially create life from nothing. It talks about the genesis of the Lizardmen and the creation of the Slann and the eventual creation of the Saurus and the Kroxigor and so on and so forth. And then we get to the region of Khuresh and how an additional set of cold-blooded creatures was created, the Snakemen and the Naga. So what we get here is something very interesting, because the way that the authors have put it out here, the Snakemen were cunning and agile fighters, highly resistant to physical pain, whereas the Naga were possessed of heightened perception and ravenous appetite, gifted learners of magic, which they swiftly grasped from the Slann. So you get this almost like a double caste system, one being more warrior oriented and one of course being more of a caster type of sorts, you know, and eventually through whatever machinations they fall out of favor and become essentially the forgotten creations of the Old Ones. The Old Ones go on to create warm-blooded creatures, right, in the humans, the elves, the dwarfs, the halflings, and the ogres. And the entire time, the Naga and the Snakemen of Khuresh look at what's going on and go, well, why were we forgotten? When those other races really encompass the same weaknesses that you saw in us and why you threw us to the wayside, why are they the ones that are getting so much of your attention? And as we know from the lore in general from Warhammer, the Old Ones created each and every race to be some way to combat against chaos. And that's what ogres were supposed to be, right? They were supposed to be the ultimate weapon against chaos before they could get finished. And then the Great Cataclysm starts and that kind of throws things awry. But it's a very interesting kind of genesis that they've created with Khuresh, with them being this very distant and forgotten, spurned almost, children of the Old Ones. The Naissance chapter comes to a close, beginning the Seeking chapter, and how it talks about the Khureshi essentially hunting all the other races and performing a massive amount of experimentations upon them, right? The Naga hunted down other life forms for their blood, bone, and souls, and conducted experiments with warpstone that the Old Ones had created to power their own arcane devices, becoming inured to its effects but never immune. And it really just talks about how there's this gentle spiral with the snake men and the Naga as they experiment more and more on elf, man, dwarf, ogre, and halfling, and, well, human, of course. Well, man is in there. But it also talks about how they get so much contempt for the warm-blooded races that they're pretty much just used as raw resources, boiling them down to their constituent parts to be used for more experimentation. It's a very kind of almost like mad scientist type of vibe to the way that the Khureshi approach trying to kind of crack the code of the Old Ones. If you kind of think of this as a juxtaposition between the Lizardmen and the Khureshi, the Lizardmen are trying to follow the whims of the Old Ones and divine what they're saying, whereas the Khureshi are seemingly trying to crack that open and try to take it for themselves, more or less. And that's me paraphrasing what I'm seeing here. But it's also an interesting juxtaposition when we talk about Khuresh versus Lustria. Lustria is, of course, this jungle Amazon that is completely overtaken by flora and fauna that is, for the most part, hostile, or creatures that inhabit it that are hostile. It's different for the Naga. They have bent it to their will. The peninsula's monstrous fauna were tamed and converted into living weapons. And that is really, I mean, if you just look at that sentence alone, it's kind of how they have boiled down, how the writers have boiled down the Naga's approach to everything. Like, okay, we have to just break it apart, figure it out, rebuild it in our image to serve us, and then go from there. So it's a very kind of interesting way that they go about things. And then they get exposure to the greenskins. And the greenskins, which are rampant on the planet, you know, the parasitic little spores that they are not spared the experimentation of the Naga. And in fact, the toil puppets, which you'll see as some of the art that comes up here, become the kind of prototype, or I'm sorry, the goblins become the prototype for these toil puppet servants that they create. And it's a very interesting way that they've written Khuresh into the lore of a lot of other races. We get a lot of intersection with the world roots because Khuresh discovers that the world roots travel under this land, and they find out that the world roots are this kind of separate, not necessarily entity, but this separate force that allows people to travel through them, right? They learn what the elves learn about this, but very similar to the paths of the Old Ones. So it is a very interesting subject that the Naga learn to break into. They learn that, here, I'll read this passage here. The Naga learned from coerced local tree spirits that sufficient sacrifices of magic or blood to the hungry denizens that guarded the world roots could be exchanged for safe passage. Later be known as the haunting Gala and Takian that continue to inhabit Khuresh to this day, these tree spirits also suffered under the Naga's caress as they sought ways to breach these pathways. From these encounters, the Naga had found intelligent life of no discernible role or value in the Old One's plans, no rigid purpose like those exhibited by the Slan and Saurus. Yet they were allowed to persist. The snake men were emboldened and more questions were asked about the nature of the world. So that goes back to what I was saying, right? About how the Naga view themselves, or not even view themselves, are actually these spurned creations of the Old One, whereas these other creatures exist without any purpose, whereas they were supposed to have a purpose. Why are they around? So it's a very kind of interesting way that they've brought everything back together in discovering the world roots of Athel Loren and how the Naga hope to eventually exploit it. In the next chapter, Rising, we get a discussion about the Great Cataclysm and how Khuresh plays a hand in that, or at least is a player in the Great Cataclysm. So after the creation of the polar warp gates at the north and south poles of the Warhammer world, the Old Ones discovered the terrible experimentations that the Naga and Snake Men are doing on some of the other races, and how they're feasting upon them, experimenting and subjugating them to all forms of terror. And they decide, it's time to kind of put this to an end. And they go to quell the Snake Men of Khuresh and Naga of Khuresh. And here's this really cool little passage here. The snakemen and naga rose up against their creators in response. Mad with long centuries of resentment, the serpent naga brutally slaughtered the local lizardmen forces, slew the slan still residing in Khuresh, conquered ancient Malay with its gateway to the paths, and laid siege to the geomantic nexus bulwark at the southern tip of Khuresh. The mighty lizardmen armies of the other continents were assembled and sent to crush the uprising, but it was not to be, for the great cataclysm had begun. And that's a really cool narrative here that they've created, that they're when you look at the lore of the old ones and of the lizardmen, you almost get this kind of utopia that has been created by the old ones, where the lizardmen and the slan are teaching the elves about magic, and the dwarfs and humans are being risen up, and you get this kind of really again, peaceful land, almost like the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, where everything is calm, and then holy shit. And I like this kind of upheaval here, where things aren't idyllic. There is a darkness to the world that the old ones have created, and it is in Khuresh. And it's a darkness of their own creation, most importantly. And that creation rises against them. It almost creates this kind of rebellion that never really gets a chance to come to fruition. Because, of course, when the Great Cataclysm begins, we get the rising of Morrslieb, the Warp Stone, Chaos Moon, and the mutations, that madness that creates, and how chaos pours over the world. And it's really interesting to see how the Khureshi respond to this, because this is someone opposing the old ones, and the old ones now are gone at this point in time. So for them, they look at this as kind of like enemy of my enemy type thing, and they decide to make an alliance with the demons. And this is also, at the same time, there's a bit of some skullduggery going on here, because the Naga secretly view the ruinous powers as their ultimate rival. They had witnessed the strength of chaos firsthand and deemed the dark god's followers to be beneficial, if fickle, allies and research subjects. And this is what spawns Nagendra. And this is kind of the chief deity, as it were, of Khuresh. Here, I'm gonna read this whole little paragraph here. It's pretty nice. An entity calling itself Nagendra emerged from before the Naga, possibly born of their collective subconscious in the aether. It recognized their ambitions and disclosed a prophecy of their apotheosis as the Iniladnuk, the divine coiling ones, in a new reality after the end of days. The Naga were convinced of their right to rule a world abandoned by its creators. Nagendra assured the Naga that their questions would be answered in time, bestowing them with generous gifts and demanding only obeisance in bloodshed. So again, you get this portion of questions coming up, and an answer to those questions. It's the biggest driving force for the Naga, finding out why they were thrown to the wayside and all of this. And Nagendra offers this, right? Now, Nagendra could just simply be a greater demon, and it says it's, basically born of the collective subconscious of the Naga itself. So you probably could just see that as a greater demon of Khuresh, more or less. And it's cool to just see this kind of created as another deity within the Chaos Pantheon, very similar to the way we look at Hashut for the Chaos Dwarfs, how that is simply a very strong demon given more strength by the belief system of the Chaos Dwarfs. And we get that same thing here with Nagendra. And this chapter closes out talking about the 12 surviving primordial Naga queens who ruled the snake men, became the first of the dreaded blood Naga queens, immortal beings of chilling aspect and abilities whose depraved hunger grew unquenchable. And these individuals basically rule over the Khureshi society, and it's, I guess you want to call it 12 factions, as it were, but it's very cool to kind of see how, yes, the world was besieged by chaos, but also you had the forces of Khuresh allying with them and helping them out in this grand adventure to subdue the warm-blooded races, and I guess lizardmen, of the Old Ones. And this brings us to our next chapter, Stranglehold. Now, with the great cataclysm popping off across the world, Khuresh takes advantage of that as best it can. It sheds off the ilk of the Old Ones and really kind of embraces everything for its own now. So the lost city of the Old Ones at the center of Khuresh was transformed into the charnel house capital of the Blood Naga. A place of twisted dimensions, its masters now called it Nagara Ishsva, the city of deliverance. And you kind of see how the Naga go about using this experimentation across everything. A great experiment, the Mahavidya, was formed with the world as its test bed and its inhabitants as its test subjects. And this spawns an additional situation. The Great Questions, the Nadani, were composed onto writhing manuscripts and differing sects of thought formed between brood factions led by the 12 blood Naga queens, who each grew more covetous and believed they alone knew how to best uncover them. So it's interesting. You get the Great Experiment, right? Very similar to the lizardmen and their scrying of the Old Ones and what their intentions were, right? And it even says here, with the Great Experiment, since the blood haze of those times, the ultimate purpose of the experiment has been forgotten, though it involved the pursuit of physical and spiritual perfection promised to them by their new patron. Remember that patron was saying it's going to rise them up. It's seen that happening at the end of times, more or less. So it's interesting that the lizardmen are stuck on this notion of trying to figure out what the Old Ones want, and the Khuresh at our timeline have just lost sight of what the Mahavidya was supposed to be because of the amount of bloodlust that had gone on since then. And throughout this time of the Great Cataclysm, the lizardmen are capturing other civilizations. They're just doing all sorts of profane rituals, very occultist style rituals. And what they're doing is a lot of experimentation upon lizardmen, and especially the Saurus and the Kroxigors. And here's this little bit right now. Having devolved their bodies and minds until they became little more than beasts of burden, the vindictive Naga would force these ruined Saurus and Kroxigors to draw the chariots and weapon platforms of their armies. And you might have seen that come up in some of the pictures I've been showing off here. One of the chariots actually has these devolved Saurus and Kroxigors as the ones that are actually pulling these chariots along. And it's a very interesting kind of way to look at the whole aesthetics of this army that they've created. And it's a really, really cool and beautiful way of doing it. Now, when it comes to mankind, there's another real cool, interesting dichotomy here as well. So rather than saying like, okay, we're going to defend mankind or we're going to uplift them, they kind of do this very interesting thing in Khuresh where they defend them and have them and help them create these farms and kind of shield them from the demons. But it's only to basically use them as like slave cities that grow humans for their experimentation and slavery. And I thought that was a pretty interesting role to take, because everything in the lore is usually very very militaristic, or it's very just cut and dry. Like, okay, we didn't like this thing, it was killed, it was destroyed. In this lore that they've created, it kind of has a little bit of a it fits into the experimentation platform of Khuresh, and I really enjoy it here, right? Let me see the part I'm looking for. So they sent indoctrinated agents to support the construction of more terrace farms among the local humans and covertly sheltered them from the elements and most demons. Thus, they did maintain a viable stock of slaves and prey. I just really love that approach was taken with them. And even as the world was saved from damnation by the creation of Ulthuan's great vortex, the Naga of Khuresh quietly rejoiced. So as the Great Cataclysm comes to an end, this means that their primary rival that Khuresh saw in the demons has been subdued enough where they can really now start to lash out. And what this does is leads to the Naga attacking the entire Warhammer world on their own accord, rather than having to kind of placate and work around the demons. It's now their time. The Snakemen launched their attack, and a new stranglehold of terror took hold, the Mahayuth. And this is encompasses almost every aspect of the Warhammer world. The lands of Inn, southern Cathay, and the archipelagos to the east were conquered in short order or put under constant assault where resistance was strong. Utilizing Dar sorcery, that's dark magic, certain armies of the Naga brood sects were able to breach both the world roots through the entrance at Khuresh and the pass of the Old Ones through the city of Malay. A hideous tide of serpents and their abominations swept across the world, clashing on multiple fronts against the elven colonies, the human protectors of Albion, the elder spirits of Athelloren, the barbarian tribes of the north, the Sky Titans, and their old lizardmen foes under the jungle canopies of the Southlands. At the Dragon Isles, the Slan-bereft lizardmen inhabitants had their mental degradation accelerated to irreversible barbarism. The world shuddered under the grip of the serpent as it fed greedily on the blood and secrets of the uncounted lives. You kind of get this forgotten history, or a history that is kept away from most eyes, right? Because elves are a part of this. It talks about the elder spirits of Athelloren. It talks about the human protectors of Albion, who already have a lore that's shrouded in a good deal of mystery. The Sky Titans, who retreat far to the northern realms, right? So it's cool that they've brought this lore, this kind of in-between lore after the Great Cataclysm, before the other races start to really kind of pop up, and how everyone has to ally again, once more, against the forces of Khuresh. The Slan mage priests eventually cause enough earthquakes that sunder the world roots under Khuresh, and then also sink Malay beneath the oceans, kind of cutting off both of those avenues for Khuresh to use to advance and attack the rest of the world. And you get this really cool last stand that happens at the southern tip of Khuresh with the last surviving Slan mage priest, and how he's fighting a war with his Saurus garrison against this endless tide of Khureshi Naga and Snakemen. And then eventually they are relieved by the daughters of Caliph. The sisterhood told of their mother's disappearance and traveled to the world to find her. They were drawn to the ley line nexus and devoted themselves to its protection, even after the elves of Ulthuan came. And how the elves of Ulthuan do bring a resplendent navy to come and assist in this and help create defenses against Khuresh. At the ending of this chapter, we get this kind of notion that Khuresh is a very ancient evil that has to be subdued and kept away from a lot of the other races. Especially, it seems to be the nascent humans of the old world, which have really yet to take prominence, right? This is way, way, way before them. So it's really interesting to see how this kind of alliance occurs and then is just hushed. Like, we don't want to talk about them. Like, we're more afraid to talk about them than the Skaven, you know, because we don't want them to get any power. We don't want someone to break them out of where they're at, because the elves create waystone fortresses that we call the Gates of Caliph, where the Cape of Khuresh threatens to reach out and touch the polluted lands of the cold south upon the battered ley line defenses originally built by the Slan to hold the southern wastes at bay. So again, you get this unification of a lot of different forces to keep Khuresh where it is. In the final chapter, Shedding, we talk a little bit more about how the Naga have been subdued now for millennia. They've been boxed into essentially where they're at, with Cathay creating fortresses and training people how to fight the Snakemen and the Naga of these locations, keeping everyone kind of hemmed into the hinterlands of Khuresh, this shrouded land where no one goes to, no one talks about. Even there's very few artifacts that even make it their way out of Khuresh itself, and it's very interesting. But we also hear about how the Skaven and the Khureshi come to interact, how a Skaven under empire exists beneath Khuresh, and how this becomes a prominent source of warpstone trade for the Khureshi to kind of really help with all their experimentation and their projects. There's a part that happens a couple chapters back that I really appreciate, and it's the description of how the lands of Khuresh look. And for me, personally, when I read it, it immediately brought up imagery of Act 3 from Diablo 2. So when you're kind of going through these very fallen ancient architecture that is twisted and corrupted. There's a really cool part here. Let's see here. The grand berets of the lost city that encompassed the sacred pools and rejuvenation chambers of the slum were defiled with cadavers or repurposed into research tanks. The spawning pools of the other captured temple cities suffered similar fates. And it just kind of reminds me of the portion when you're fighting against Mephiston in that very bottom portion of Act 3, where it's just what would have once been just beautiful water is just blood. And what would have had just probably flora and fauna on the banks of it has corpses and has skulls, and it's immediately the imagery that kind of was conjured into my mind. And I don't know if that's what they had intended, but that's the way I kind of looked at it. So it's a very cool way to kind of approach this, right? So as shedding kind of concludes here, it talks about the 12 Marga brood sects of the Blood Naga Queens and how they've all kind of devolved into very specific portions of Khureshi society, right? Some of them think that some of them are very zealous and fanatical, right? Others are very heavy into the experimentations. Other ones have learned to go down underwater and kind of withstand the ocean pressure and return to the halls of Malay for the paths of the old ones. And another one here, still others have taken to crossing the hazardous realm of the Dreaming Wood to stage expeditions into the far north, intent on putting an end to their queries through dangerous new experiences. So where the society was once linked in the beginning, especially during the Great Cataclysm, it is now kind of split off into these 12 sects, as it were. That's like I slithered that out. A little too Naga for me. Now, we get two instances of Khuresh intersecting with the world, in which case Oxyotl, the chameleon skink character from the Lizardmen, pops up in the city of the old one city that was located in the center of Khuresh, right? The Nagara Ishsva. And he doesn't tell anyone what he saw. That's how badly it rocks him to his core. And then we get the twin-tailed comet in 2519 and how this kind of spurs the as an omen that sets the Khureshi up to start their new grand invasions across the Warhammer world. But this brings our a close to the origins and lore created by our authors here, both KingKongRong and xBloodRaven. There's one last part we're going to talk about with the Sarpa Warrior. It's the only other unit that they've created so far, but they will be talking about a lot more a lot more units. They've created a whole army list for this. They've also created some sub-factions with a bunch of emblems and everything. So please, there is tons to follow with these guys. They are going to be posting Reddit posts on this. They're going to be posting on their worldanvil.com, so make sure you're following these two things. You'll be able to see more and more coming out of them because they have so much beautiful stuff to show you guys. Let's jump into this Sarpa Warrior. So here we go into the Sarpa Warrior, and this is the entry that was shared on the Reddit today, the beautiful concept art by Ruo Yu, which you'll be seeing as I read through the essentially the same lore blurb that you would read when you jump into any of the Warhammer army books. So I'm going to read through that, and then we're going to discuss the possible iterations of how this could push its way into Total War Warhammer. The 8-foot-tall Sarpa warriors are the backbone of the Snake Men armies, a role they have proudly kept since the earliest days. Robust and resourceful, they were created with an innate thirst for combat and bloodletting, and with a resolute sense of loyalty towards their brood and Naga queens. The most numerous of the Snake Men castes, the Sarpa are robust fighters of cold-blooded practicality. The Sarpa care nothing for honor. They fight viciously to satisfy their own bloodlust and to cruelly dominate their adversaries. They are the creatures most often found raiding and capturing the younger races to feed the insatiable hunger of their blood Naga queens. The Sarpa's large size betrays their sharp reflexes and startlingly quick speed. Adapted to the harsh environment of Khuresh, they are near immune to disease, possess a resilience to pain and trauma that would kill species of the younger races many times over, and are capable of regenerating limb damage after some time. When brought to war, the Sarpa prefer to waylay the enemy in ambushes or strike at the flanks of armies, their natural agility allowing them to respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The Sarpa wield undaunting blades forged of meteoric iron and strange halberds designed to leave wicked gouging wounds. All of these are ritualistically coated in a brew of lethal toxins derived from their own venom glands. Even a scratch from these weapons causes victims to die in agony, as their flesh swells and hideously bloats with necrosis and their blood clots like spoiled milk or run in rivulets from their orifices. Disarming a Sarpa is futile, for they will simply strike with their dripping fangs that can puncture through light mail and leather armor, injecting their prey with paralyzing venom that peels flesh like shed skin. Even in its death throes, the Sarpa can lash out in a final act of spite, dousing their enemies with caustic blood. One brood is known to equip their Sarpa warriors with an entire arsenal of warpstone weapons. Over the centuries, the Blood Naga Queens have experimented with many iterations of the Sarpa form. Some have rattles on their tails that cause fear in warm-blooded prey when they reverberate. Others possess chameleonic skin or the controllable mandibles of venomous insects grafted on their tails, allowing the Sarpa to strike from unexpected angles. Certain specimens are stricken by unnatural mutations, with jagged bones protruding from their scales and jutting horns on their heads, like miniature versions of the Sawanok serpent. The Sarpa that stalk the halls of sunken Malay have evolved gills and adapted their bodies to the high pressure of the ocean depths. Those who frequently venture into the Dreaming Wood and the wastes of the north and south bear mutations from multiple eyes to serrated pincers and bony blades for hands. So you can see that these guys have quite an arsenal at their disposal. And I really think it all comes down to how the authors want to create the faction mechanics behind them. Do these guys have a ton of kind of slave experiment cast brainwash warriors, and these are the first actual Naga you'd have in your army, so they're a little bit more elite? Or is this the first actual, this is your base troop, like your state troop, as it were? And the different variations that you've got here are Chris Spear plus shield, mock halberd, or double hand weapons. And I think that's a really fun way to look at this, right? You get your basic anti-large with a shield, you get your halberd, which adds anti-large and AP, or hand weapons, which gives you that anti-infantry. And even kind of looking at how they've done the lore for this, you could kind of look at this almost in the same light as taking a look at the Clan Mulder labs with their experimentation. And that plays heavily into the lore that they've created as well for Khuresh. So what if there was like a, not a cloning vat, because that's too much like Mulder, but what if there are these corrupted spawning pools where you can almost create different Sarpa warriors very similar to the way you can with again, with Mulder and also with the Greenskin scrap system. So you can create Sarpa warriors with scorpion tails, or you can create Sarpa warriors that have those rattlers so they do cause fear. And I think what will be interesting too is taking a look at how their stats would come across. I think if they had very high melee attack to represent their quickness and low armor to represent that maybe it's a little bit harder to, put a bunch of armor on what is essentially a serpent. So high melee attack, low armor, high melee defense, because again, they are mobile, and give them a little bit of physical resistance. Very similar to what we get with witch elves. Witch elves have no armor, have their innate dodge as a physical resistance buff, and have good melee defense and high melee attack. I'd love to see that represented here for the Sarpa infantry if this were something that actually ever came to Total War, or even in a mod. It'd be cool to see it like that. So this is kind of a fun way to talk about this. And they even said, like, we want you to take a look at the lore for this and what we have in mind for just the general mechanics, and we want you to run rampant, because we know that you're going to come up with something that we probably didn't even think about. So this is my kind of way of looking at what they have in mind and saying, hey, these would be cool ways to build mechanics around it, or build in certain things to the faction itself that then lends itself to the lore of not just the faction, but to the Sarpa infantry. So I'm really excited yet again, guys, like I was saying, for more expansions on the brood of the Naga Queens. Please check out the Reddit post, check out the World Anvil. Everything is going to be linked in the description and the pinned comment. And in the Reddit post, you have links to Ruo Yu's site, to Cobol Yu's site, and links to both KingKongRong and xBloodRaven, so you can see a little bit more about them. If you're on Reddit or if you're on the forums, you know who these gentlemen are. They have shared plenty of art or different writings about a lot of the lore, or a lot about potential army lists. So these guys are very steeped in the community, and they're very steeped in the lore, as well as a really great and amazing understanding of Warhammer as a whole. So thank you guys so much for watching here today. I know this was kind of a random little video, but I was very excited to talk about it and show off the amazing lore here of Khuresh. But as always, have a good one and take care.